Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here at CSIS. Thank you for your patience. We are having some audio-visual difficulties, so, I'm being told we're all set. Okay, we're all set. So if we have any problems on the live stream, we will be capturing this and be able to put it back up on the web later, just in case something happens on the live stream. Let me begin with our security announcement. We begin all events this way. We feel very secure here at CSIS in our building, but we do have some building safety precautions that I want to share. If there should be any kind of fire alarm, an incident like that, there are doors behind you that lead to Rhode Island Avenue. That's likely the way you came in. And there are doors behind me that lead to the back of our building out toward M Street. So just follow my signals should something like that occur. Today's discussion of our military strategy forum is a conversation with General Paul Selva, who is the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to talk a little bit today about military innovation. General Selva is a command pilot by training. He has been commander of U.S. Transportation Command and the Air Force's Air Mobility Command. He served as assistant to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's even done time in the dreaded Office of the Secretary of Defense in both the Office of Net Assessment and previously on the Secretary's Strategic Studies Group. So we're very fortunate to have him with us today to talk about his perspective on military innovation at this critical time. It's quite a buzzword, and we want to hear a little bit about what he thinks it means. And then he and I will have a little dialogue, and we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So please join me in welcoming General Selva.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I always wonder who the old man is that you're introducing. But thank you for the kind words. Dr. Hamre, thank you for the collective invitation to come and participate in this chat. And believe it or not, the format is a chat. And I don't intend to spend the entire hour up here giving you a lecture on my opinions on military innovation and reform within institutions. But I will start with some overarching comments to try and help set the groundwork for where we might take this conversation. So most of you are at least on some level students of history. It was about 69 years ago this month that the National Security Reform Act of 1947 was passed and signed into law. That established the tools that allowed for the modern formulation of foreign security and national security policy, of foreign affairs policy, of diplomatic policy. And it actually knitted together the disparate cabinet ministries within our government that were vying for the president's time to try and help understand what the dynamics of the Cold War might look like. The reason I used that example today is A, it's quite timely, and B, it is an exceptional example of institutional reform, of a process by which institutions realize that they have a problem they must solve, that it is not a problem of an operational or tactical nature, but one of a strategic nature, that is about the relationships of the organizations inside the institution. And reform is about making those relationships more useful to the decision makers who rely on those organizations. And so I would submit to you that the National Security Act of 1947 is one of those processes of reform within our government that has stood the test of time. You can debate all you want how we use the structures that were built in the Act, but in point of fact, absent the creation of the National Security Council and the creation of the Defense Department to oversee and harmonize the efforts of all of the services, we would likely be in a very different place. And so I would like to begin by saying my opinion of reform is that it's about getting the institution to serve the leaders in the institution and getting the institution to serve the people in the organizations that must execute the policies that process results in. And I think we have a pretty good one. But today's challenges are exponentially different than the challenges that were faced by the United States and our allies in the years immediately following the close of World War II. This is not about a Cold War, but it's about a multipolar world that has many more variables that affect our decision processes. And so when I testified for my confirmation for this position, I was explicitly asked what the threats to our national security are. And my view on that has matured significantly because they're really not threats, they're challenges. They're challenges that we as a nation and we as a collection of allies have to face, not just today, but over the course of the next several decades. Secretary Work describes what we're facing as a period of great power competitions. And so the first two challenges that come to mind are our relationship with Russia and our relationship with China, and how those relationships affect the security of the United States, of our allies, partners, and friends, and the broader security of the world. And they are global challenges. There is very little in our relationship with Russia that doesn't accrue to the global stage almost instantaneously, and the same is true of our relationship with China. And so we have to have in place structures and processes that help us manage the tough decisions that will have to be made in those contexts. The next two things that I described as threats, which I now describe as challenges, are the potential for conflict with Iran and North Korea over a whole variety of issues, not the least of which is both of their aspirations to become nuclear powers. Our agreement with Iran that staunches that program for a number of years is a positive development, but it's not the end, it's the beginning. It's not the end of that relationship, it's the beginning of a relationship that might be built on compliance with that plan. North Korea is a challenge because it is such an opaque place. It's closed to most of our intelligence community, and it is closed to most of our military strategists. We only know what we know about North Korea because of the bits and pieces that we can collect. And understanding the trajectory of North Korea is critical to understanding the trajectory of security in the Western Pacific. So we have to get at that problem. And the last challenge is one that I believe will be with us for some time, and that is the challenge of combating violent extremism. And I won't put a single label on it, because we have watched violent extremism over the course of the last couple of decades morph in ways we had not anticipated. And so I would suggest to you the following. While we think we understand the dynamics of some of the variables of violent extremism today, that does not give us a crystal clear view of where it might go. And so together, we have to be able to work with our diplomats, with members of our industrial partnerships and our economic partners around the world, with like-minded democracies and like-minded governments around the world to try and get at this problem and get ahead of it. And so those are the 5 challenges. And inside those 5 challenges, I think there is room for continuing reform in the institutions of our government and our department that help our leaders manage and understand those challenges and react quickly inside of the variables that define those challenges. But there's also room for substantial innovation. And I draw a distinction between the two. Innovation is about tactical, operational, and strategic level choices inside organizations to adopt new ways of doing things that can make them more effective or more efficient or possibly both, and that might represent step changes in their capacity to respond to those 5 challenges I just laid out. Innovation in organizations the size of the Defense Department is not a simple process, but it is based on the very same tenets that innovation anywhere else is based on. People who are willing to bring new ideas to the floor, people who are willing to take risk with those ideas, and people who are willing to fail. Now, I've been told the military is genetically predisposed not to innovate. I would suggest to you that is as far from the truth as any other thing you might say. The military that brought you GPS doesn't innovate. The military that brought you tactical innovation on the battlefield doesn't innovate. The military that brought you air-land battle in the 70s and 80s and has continued to refine that capacity almost to a science is more than capable of innovation. but you have to convince us. Because we grow up assessing risk. It started my first day on active duty. When I showed up at pilot training, they said, you're going to get about 10 hours of simulator instructor time, and then we're going to ask you to get in that airplane and go fly. You will have an instructor by your side who will teach you what you need to know, and in 10 hours, you are going to go fly by yourself. It's a little ceremony we call the solo. If you don't think there's a little risk assessment in climbing into a jet airplane with 10 hours of flight time to go fly by yourself without the comfort of an instructor to correct those minor errors that could turn into catastrophe, you are kidding yourself. And so we wire that into our leaders early in their training to assess the risk they are taking in everything they do. It's not that we're risk averse, it's that we are eminently conscious of risk. Because the risk we're taking is not purely financial. It has huge consequences. It generally involves human life or an operation whose success or failure accrues to the security of our nation. And so are we a little careful? You bet. Does it keep us from changing the way we do business? Not even. But what we face over the next couple of decades is several very imaginative competitors who have actually looked at what we have done over the last 2 decades, reflected it back upon us, and challenged us with some of the very same techniques and procedures we are challenging them with. And that becomes very difficult to counter. So that's the environment we find ourselves in. Great power competitions with powers who are not necessarily our equal, but are pretty close, but have picked asymmetric approaches, strategically and operationally, that seriously challenge us. And so we have to think differently about this problem. I'll add a third dimension to why innovation is so important inside of our military. And that is, for the better part of my career, most of the technology changes that happened inside of our military were born inside of our military. They were born inside of our department. They were the product of internal innovation, and that is no longer true. The forces that will impact our department and our militaries, all of them, in every country in the world, are more likely going to come from innovation in the commercial sector than they will from real technological change inside of our militaries. And we have to learn how to capitalize on that. I'll give you an example, just one. If we want to capitalize on the growth in commercial imaging satellites to help solve military problems over the next 2 decades, we have to start now. Because the projection is that if we want to take advantage of that and do it the way we do it today, we'll need 8 million more imagery analysts working 24 hours a day to analyze all the pixels that will come off of all of the commercial satellites that will be taking pictures of our planet. If any of you happen to have 8 million analysts in your back pocket, sign me up. But I suspect no country in the world has that capacity. So we have to find a different way. The different way comes with treating that as a big data source and using big data analytic techniques to get at the nuggets that are inside all of those pixels. That's an example. That means we become incredibly efficient in analysis, and it portends but does not guarantee that we become more effective. And that's why I say I need people with ideas who are willing to experiment and who are willing to fail. Because a problem that big isn't going to be solved with one bright idea. A problem that big is not amenable to an overnight solution. And so we have to decompose it. We have to look at the tools that we might apply to that problem and change the way we look at the value of that data because it has military value. That is an example. The reason that is so important, the reason that speed becomes important in the future, it's already important today, but will become more so, is the techniques that our adversaries are using to challenge us aim to hold us at distance. I would submit to you they aim to hold us at distance by applying long-range precision strike, kinetic and non-kinetic, at volume. We used to label that anti-access area denial. It is a strategy, a concept someone might try to impose upon you. But when you do it, when you describe it that way, it's very hard to decompose. So my question to every group when they bring me that challenge is, what are the pieces of it? What are the constituent parts of that strategy that we can leverage? If it's precision strike, long range at volume, there are pieces we can get at. We can get at them by understanding that network better. We can get at them by understanding the speed of decision that's required for them to use those weapon systems. We can get at them by understanding our own vulnerabilities. We can get at them by understanding the value of time in that equation. Those are not solutions, they're questions. And so if I have a young officer or a young member of the department that comes to me with an idea that says, I think I can make our decision process more efficient or more effective, or I think I can make our command and control process more efficient or more effective, if that increases our speed of response and creates tactical, operational, and strategic options, I'm willing to listen. My challenge to them is, are you willing to be wrong? If we form a hypothesis and build an experiment, you have to be willing to be wrong. Then we can discount that idea and move on to another one. And my experience with commercial industry tells me that innovation in commercial industry is exactly that process. It's fast, but it's iterative. Failure is acceptable, repeated failure maybe not, but it moves at the speed of a small brush fire, and it fertilizes everything in its path as it burns out the underbrush. And people who are successful at it are astronomically successful at it. The problem we have in the department is we treat every bit of innovation like a forest fire. We bring out the fire brigades and we try to put it out. Because innovation is only good if you're right. Failure's not an option. Asking hard questions is only acceptable if you know the answer. And none of that fosters innovation. So I've tried to put the fire brigade back in the firehouse, and I've tried to find a handful of people who are willing to take risk. And they are all over the department. And they've come forward with a set of bright ideas. And so we're going to test them. One of you is going to try to ask me to enumerate the bright ideas. I will tell you right now, I do not carry them around in my pocket. And by the way, most of them I'm not willing to talk about. But these young men and women are out there, and they're not bashful, and they're capable, and they're motivated, and they're loyal to the cause of defending freedom and liberty. And I can't think of a better group of people to try and figure this problem out. And so I go out and collect them. And then I encourage them. And I motivate them. And I'm not the only person doing this. If I were, that would be an innovation insurgency, and I don't have the energy for that. This is now becoming systemic in the department, where senior leaders are asking young officers and young enlisted men and women for their ideas. They're asking our young civilians and our old civilians for their ideas. And we're trying to triage those ideas and parse through as many as we can and find out which ones actually constitute the nuggets of potential change in our organization that will make us more effective on the future battlefield. It was in the late 50s, by the way, that President Eisenhower was faced with what we are now calling the first offset. What's the strategy going to be like in this new Europe that's collapsing around itself and rebuilding itself? And the forces of the Cold War were coming to the fore. And here's what he said. Our real problem then is not our strength today. It is rather the vital necessity of action today to ensure our strength tomorrow. I don't think any of you would label Dwight David Eisenhower a huge innovator. But those are the words of an innovator. It isn't enough to assert the strength and readiness of our force today. It isn't enough to assert the superiority of the capabilities that exist within the men and women of our military today. It is necessary but not sufficient. What we owe them, what we owe all of the citizens of the United States and the citizens of the countries that are our allies, partners, and friends, is the vision to get at what that force needs to look like in 10 or 20 years, to carry that same kind of superiority forward. That is the flame that ignites the forest fire that will be innovation within the Defense Department. And we owe it to every person that we serve and that we lead to encourage them to get at it. And so there are a lot of people in the department that are doing just that. So with that, I am happy to take your questions. Again, thank you so much for the invitation today.
Well, these guys just a second. There we go. Thank you much, General Selva. That was a great framework to have this discussion on innovation. And you started out with the challenges, and it's certainly anyone listening to you today or just picking up their paper or reading it online more likely is struck by how broad the spectrum is, how immense the challenge set at least feels. And setting for innovation, looking for the future, setting priorities in that environment is very difficult, particularly in an environment where resources are not fully unconstrained. I wonder if you can talk, even if you can't talk about the list, you're not walking with the list of projects from a problem set perspective or solution set perspective. Can you talk a little bit about what's at the top of your mind of big issues that the department needs to tackle if it's going to innovate for the future?
So I think there are probably three. The first one is human capital. And that goes back to my comments about encouraging people to continue to pursue their educations, but also to continue to ask questions. Again, that's not something we bake into our fielded force, because what we do on the battlefield is about the disciplined application of violence to an enemy. And I'm picking those words very carefully. So we teach a level of discipline to our force that some might believe says, you're not allowed to ask questions. We need to build back in and continue to build into that process. This idea that the actual activity of military operations must be disciplined. But that doesn't mean that we don't go back and look at how we did them and ask questions of how we get better over time. And that's the difference between operational art and strategy. And so encouraging our young men and women to mature in their thinking about what we do so that they move from being experts in operational art to strategic thinkers is part of that leader development process that we have to continue. Human capital is absolutely critical in this space. The second is an understanding of the broad trajectories of technology. And I don't mean the technology inside the military, but the technology outside the military. And so we're using a variety of mechanisms to get at that. We have partnered with industry. We've partnered with the leading edge of the technology community to look at what the broad vectors are for future technologies. And the one we find most compelling is today, the partnership of humans and machines to speed decision. I alluded to that in the, can we compress the time it takes to make decisions? This is not something that's new to us. You mentioned that I was a SecDef fellow. That was 1997.
Right.
The conversation that we had with Secretary Perry in that fellowship was actually about the confluence of smart machines and smart humans to actually empower the humans to be faster at the decision-making processes that are critical to making strategy and operational art work. So the idea of technology in the civilian sector and the commercial sector pushing how the military thinks about itself isn't really new, but it's become more urgent. And the reason it's become more urgent is in 1996, we spent almost 10 times the amount that the civilian community spent on this kind of research. Today, those numbers are almost flipped. IT companies around the world are so rich in capital, relatively speaking to what they looked like in 1996, that they have flipped that equation on its head. And so we have to be educated consumers of that technology. And that means helping develop the people that are willing to do that research and understand how those technologies can help us. And then the third is about operational design. It's not necessarily about the individual technologies, but what do they portend for the command and control mechanisms in our military? What do they portend for the leadership models in our military? Because today, a single leader in any one of our services is actually empowered to bring to the fight more firepower than a dozen or more of his predecessors 20 years ago, because of the speed of our ability to analyze and move information, our capacity to exercise precision operations at distance, and the utility of the weapons that we've built over the last couple of decades. So we've got to get at all three, and they don't all happen at the same pace. The longest term investment in that process is getting that 21-year-old lieutenant or ensign and that 17-year-old airman, sergeant, or private to grow through that process of understanding how they evolve with the organization and mature their thinking.
I do think a lot of the innovation conversation does tend to get reduced to the technology side. So I wonder if I can continue to draw you out on the leadership and the operational concept development, the institutional backbone to sort of create that ability to work with technology, to train and to lead from the operational level and the art. How would you assess where the department is today, and is it basically on the right course and trajectory, or are there changes that need to be made?
I would suggest we're on the right vector, but we need to add a little more magnitude to the vector, to borrow an engineering term. So we're not moving fast enough. We're moving in the right direction, but time is not on our side. And so the idea that we can quickly build a cadre of people that are going to have a deep understanding of how technology is going to affect us over time, I think is a big mistake. And so we need to build them as fast as we can, but you can't demand them overnight. And so in my heart, I believe this is about a partnership between the people that understand the technologies and are willing to expose them to our military in a way that helps us understand how they work, and the practitioners of the military art. And that is a very different partnership than exists today, because it's a much broader partnership. I would suggest to you that with all of our large defense companies, that is a very natural relationship. But if I went into a company that has no relationship with the military and said, your technology looks really interesting to me and I think it has military utility, many of those companies would initially stand back and say, but what does that mean to me? I can't absorb a contract on the scale that the Defense Department might bring it to me, or I'm not really interested in being associated with the military. I'm a completely civilian function that I didn't think my technology made a difference to the military. So building those relationships carefully is really important.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to get at that. We've got to educate people on how to do that.
One of the other key partnerships is on Capitol Hill, and then with any given political leadership inside an administration. And you talked, I thought, very, very eloquently about risk, or convincing us. There was a great way to put it. But there are those who their primary risk calculus is about the taxpayers and accountability of funds. Not to say that that's not also a military concern, but you have to convince them too that this, more of a hedge fundy approach where failure is part of the innovative, it actually is in the long-term taxpayer interest. Can you give me a sense of how those conversations have gone, and whether you think you have strong partners outside the military who are willing to take a responsible but risk-willing approach?
I think we have willing partners. I think the hard part here is the desire to have an explanation of precisely where we're going. Mm-hmm. If I knew, mm-hmm. I would issue that direction and say, let's just get busy and get there. But in point of fact, as we look at the challenges we're facing, we don't know precisely what the next step is going to be. We have an idea, and we want to test those. It's a set of ideas. We want to test those ideas. But this gets to the accountability part, means you have to be able to, you must be willing to accept that some of those ideas won't mm-hmm. pan out. And we're not venture capitalists. I'm not placing bets I don't think are going to pay off. In a sense, we are a little bit like venture capitalists in this innovation space, because we are literally trying to triage and figure out where the highest payoff might be, and place that bet and determine if that technology or that concept will pay off. And that's going to require a small investment of capital. Mm-hmm. As long as we keep the number small on both the amount invested and the magnitude of failure, we're likely going to continue to have willing partners. But where this could come unglued really fast is if somebody says, we don't understand where you're trying to go. You're spending way too much money, and we see no success. And so we're going to have to moderate when we make those bets. But none of them are big bets. They're bets on big change, but they're not big financial bets.
Just by the very structure of the department, a lot of the investment funds are in the services. Services have that long-term man, train, and equip responsibility. And yet, of course, we've tried post-Goldwater Nichols to move to a force that's more effective and efficient joint. You're the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A lot of that responsibility comes squarely to you through the legislative, the statutory elements relating to joint requirements. What's your sense of the degree to which the future joint warfighter is represented well inside deliberations about how to prioritize funds, where the big challenges are, and the ability to pull the community together to joint solutions?
A great question. And as many of you know, the joint requirements process is one that's both statutory and regulatory. In the absence of an oversight process that allows the chairman, through the vice chairman's office, to determine whether or not the investment programs of the services are going to contribute to or deter the interoperability of the joint force. In the absence of that process, then we run the risk that we arrive in a place where we were 20, 30 years ago, where with the best of intentions, services actually diverged. And in the space we're talking about over the next 20 years, where moving information in the battle space is likely to be as valuable as moving the kinetic tools in the battle space, as an example, the divergence of the services on the how, the when, and the if to move that information and build those command and control systems that allow for speed of action in that battle space could be a detriment to the interoperability of the joint force. So as we look towards the future, we need to look towards a rational process of making sure that the chairman,
through the Vice Chairman's office, has the capacity to provide the oversight of programs that must be joint from inception based on the fact that the processes that empower that force are joint by design. And so I think we take grave risk with the system if we're not careful about how we build that reform in. So I'm not talking about innovation in the requirement space. This is about reform and how we define and categorize and measure our performance against requirements that assure that the force remains joint. We are inexorably joint. That is a fact. Our services over the course of the last 30 years have become increasingly joint with every year that passes. And so the Army can't fight without the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps, nor could any of the other services fight without their sister services, because we have pulled out of those services redundant and repetitive tasks that were unnecessary or were layered on simply to mitigate risk without real operational benefit. And so it would be unthinkable to send one of our services to fight without the other services there as part of that joint force. And so we don't talk about sending the Army to a fight or sending the Navy to a fight. We talk about sending the force, and it is inherently joint. So there is a requirement up front to pay attention to whether the tools that are being built under the authorities of the man, train, and equip responsibilities of the individual service chiefs are actually going to further that jointness or deter that jointness. And I think that's an obligation that we shouldn't let go of lightly.
And you feel that the processes that you have in place today or the department has in place today are effective in achieving that end?
I would say they're effective, but they are not perfect. And so the obligation of the institution is to continue to reform where reform makes sense.
Yeah.
To continue to strip out unnecessary steps in the process where those steps are redundant and add no value. And we have gone about that process over the last several years. My predecessor started the process. We continue the process inside the JROC with the service vices to pull out of that system those steps that we believe as a corporate body do not add value to our assessment of whether or not the capabilities that are being brought to the JROC represent inherently joint functions that must have the oversight of the chairman and the office of the vice chairman.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then turn it over to the audience. Innovation is always linked with ethical questions. It always has been, and it is today. Can you talk a little bit about the way in which the department is bringing those ethical questions forward as it looks at areas like autonomy? You mentioned big data as one piece of that, but autonomy is not the only area. How is the department weaving in those ethical considerations?
That's an excellent question. Principally, we're managing the oversight of the innovation process. And I'm using those words guardedly because it's really not oversight, but leadership of the innovation process. But it does have a part of it that is genuinely about oversight. To try and bring in from both the outside community, the academic, as well as the technical community, and inside the department, our legal counsel and ethical advisors, to get at the potential pitfalls of bringing technology into the execution of warfare. And I choose my words carefully here as well. I'm not bashful about what we do. My job as a military leader is to witness unspeakable violence on an enemy. In the end, when you send me and any soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine from the United States or an ally, partner, and friend out to defend the interests of our nations, our job is to defeat the enemy. And so inside of that context, the methods by which we execute our mission are governed by law and by convention. And one of the places that we spend a great deal of time is determining whether or not the tools we are developing absolve humans of the decision to inflict violence on the enemy. And that is a fairly bright line that we're not willing to cross. And so we have insisted that as we look at potential innovations over the course of the next couple of decades, that one of the benchmarks in that process is that we not build a system that absolves our human leaders of the decision to execute a military operation, and that we not create weapons that are wholly and utterly autonomous of human interaction. And that's not a tall order. It's a fairly easy thing to say, and it's a pretty easy thing to sign up to. But in the world of autonomy, as we look at what our competitors might do in that same space, the notion of a completely robotic system that can make a decision about whether or not to inflict harm on an adversary is here. It's not terribly refined, it's not terribly good, but it's here. And as we develop systems that incorporate things like artificial intelligence and autonomy, we have to be very careful that we don't design them in a way that we create a situation where those systems actually absolve humans of that decision. And that ethical boundary is one that we've drawn a fairly fine line on. But it is one that we must continue to understand because it is entirely possible that as we work our way through this process of bringing enabling technologies into the department, that we could get dangerously close to that line. And we owe it to ourselves and to the people we serve to keep that a very bright line.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for audience questions for the Vice Chairman. When I call on you, please give me your name, and if you have an affiliation, your affiliation. It's one question, and it is a question. So we'll start right here with this gentleman, 4 rows back. Right here with the glasses, yep.
Good morning, General. I'm John Wertman with the American Association of Geographers. You spoke at the outset about our relationship with Russia and how it's a key global challenge. One of the contested spaces that's key in that challenge is the Arctic. The Coast Guard is in the process of trying to secure funding to develop a heavy icebreaker for the first time in 40 years. Several of the procurement ideas that have been floated for that have involved DoD in one way or the other. What do you think the DoD role should be in bringing a new heavy icebreaker on board as an asset? And do you want to talk about that within the context of the Arctic?
Yeah, I'll avoid the procurement of a single system, but I will talk about the security of the Arctic. So all of the countries that border on the Arctic have legitimate claims in the Arctic, both in terms of resource and access. And so the fact that we don't have the capacity in any material way to have a surface presence in the Arctic is something that we ought to address. Whether that means we need 1 or 2 or 4 or 12 heavy icebreakers, I'll leave that to the experts. But from a strategic perspective, the ability to surveil and understand and manage the change that's happening in the Arctic accrues to our interests and the interests of all of the countries that have features that border the Arctic, and that includes Russia. And so having a reasonable approach to how we get at that is important. To the question of whether heavy icebreakers are the solution, I'm not sure they're the solution. They're probably part of the solution set. How we buy them, I'm going to leave that to people who worry that problem every day.
Great. Let's swing this side. There's a woman about 4 rows back on that side in black.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein with Sputnik International News. I'd like it if you could unpack the joint U.S.-Turkey operations in Syria this past week, how you see that operation to rid the border town of Islamic State troops impacting the U.S.-Turkey relationship, that alliance, and then the U.S. alliance with the Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Forces.
We like easy questions.
Yeah, real easy ones. So I would just make 2 very quick points on that. Again, I won't get into the details of the operation because it's ongoing, but we have supported our Turkish allies in their effort to secure their border, and the operation that our Turkish allies undertook just 24 hours ago, which is ongoing, is one of those efforts. It is a border crossing that was in the hands of the Islamic State, and we rendered assistance in their effort to retake that border crossing and to secure that area, to deny ISIL the capacity to move fighters across the Turkish border with relative impunity. We have continued our relationship with willing fighters in Syria, including Kurdish fighters that have enabled a group called the Syrian Arab Coalition, and we intend to continue to do so.
Great. Okay, let's come to this area. I've got one, let's see, I cannot identify. Dark hair, hand in the air, yes. Thank you,
There's
gentlemen.
3 of those out there.
Yeah.
Orange tie. General, thank you. My name is Greg Schuckman. I'm from the University of Central Florida, and thank you
Can you
for
bring
your
your mic closer?
Thank you for your perspective and for your service, sir. When you talk about innovation, I always think, coming from an academic perspective, about the science and technology base, and the fact that when you talk about our competitors and the rate of increase that they have with their tech-based budgets, and ours has been relatively flat for a long time. When you talk about the question about human capital and technological innovation, that sounds like the universities as much as industry and anybody else. So I was wondering if you could talk about, looking at that time horizon out, what do we do about the tech base?
I'm guilty of actually saying it's commercial industry that brings us innovation. It actually starts in labs. It starts with basic science. The knowledge we have today about autonomy and artificial intelligence and deep learning and big data didn't actually come from individual companies. It came from individual scientists in individual laboratories who worked on those problems and built the basic science that lets us understand those. So our outreach to the community involves more than just the technology sector, as in the commercial sector that brings us technologies. We're very interested in getting to university laboratories and scientists and individual researchers. Principally, we do that through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, but not exclusively. So that outreach continues. It is fair to say that our investment in basic sciences and our investment in basic research and technology has been flat for a while. Given the state of our budget, almost everything in our budget has been flat for a while.
Flat is the new up.
I've heard that said, flat is the new up. This is the assertion I would make to you. That is not necessarily predestined, that it will stay flat forever, or that it will stay flat for the near to distant future. But I think for anyone to have an immediate expectation that because we're talking about innovation, we are going to increase in large volume our research and development investment is actually promising something that's likely not to happen. Because given the current pressure on the defense budget, and it's not a small budget, by the way. I have a favorite quote to hate. It's a Churchill quote. I love Churchill quotes, but this one is, gentlemen, we're out of money, it's time to think. The department is far from broke, and it is far from broken. But structurally and fiscally, there are demands on our budget that give us very little maneuvering space over the next 5 to 10 years. And so we have to be very, very careful about how we maneuver inside that budget. And so we're fond of saying we try to balance modernization, force structure, and readiness. That's shorthand. And it doesn't serve the nation well when we say that, but it's the best way we can describe what we're trying to do. How do we build a force for the future that's reasonable and gives us advantage, while maintaining the readiness of the force today that has significant demands on its structure, and then maintain a structure that matters. So structure, readiness, and modernization actually end up being the shorthand that we choose. But you almost need a PhD in how to build a budget to get to the details of what any one of those three means. So I would say, yes, we're very interested in basic research. Yes, we're very interested in what's coming out of our universities and laboratories. But I don't see a vast increase in the funding coming.
Okay, still continuing on this side. Quiet side, we'll go right here.
Good morning, General. Daniel Young. I'm a major in the U.S. Army, and I'm studying at SAIS. I'd like to talk about organizational innovation, which is tied into institutional reform. So in Congress and in the DoD itself, there's lots of efforts at reforming the Nichols-Goldwater Act. Where do you see these efforts, and what do you see actually coming from them? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So Goldwater Nichols basically made us joint. We weren't born joint, and we resisted. I mean, the history of that process is over 5 consecutive years of actual effort to draft the legislation, and almost a decade before that, we pushed back. We, the military, we, the department, pushed back on the notion that we have to grow joint officers and we have to grow a joint force, that it isn't already inherently joint, to our detriment. The processes and the reforms that were built into Goldwater Nichols have stood the test of time. We're 30 years on. Goldwater Nichols was solving a problem, a definable problem, and that was that our services had grown up in stovepipes and were not inherently interoperable. Imagine that time in our history. It's the mid-'80s. We are demanding of our NATO partners, of our NATO allies, that they build a force that's interoperable with our force at an international level, only to look inside of our services and understand that our services themselves were not joint. And so the legend is that in the invasion of Grenada, a young Army Special Forces captain had to use his AT&T credit card to call back to Fort Bragg to bring in supporting fires from the U.S. Air Force Special Operations gunship overhead that was supposed to be part of his joint force. That's lunacy. So building a structure around that to say, how do we fix that problem, an endemic problem in our services that makes us inherently not joint? We instituted a set of organizational reforms. By the way, I will not call them innovation. They were organizational reforms that forced us into what has proven to be an incredibly insightful organizational structure that provides not only for jointness down to the deck plates and the battlefields, but also provides for the jointness of advice that goes to the Secretary of Defense and the President. That, A+ on the homework. Is it perfect? No. But it served us well. And so the reforms that are being proposed now are about looking down into that structure and saying, did we get any of it wrong? Are there things we could do better? And in those places where that reform is being proposed, I think it's a healthy discussion and debate. But how long has the debate been going on? Less than a year. So the insights that people are bringing forward saying, I have a bright idea to change the way the department or the joint force do business, should be tested just like Goldwater Nichols was tested. They should be examined and debated and then implemented. And I'm not suggesting delay, I'm suggesting careful analysis. And so there are some really good ideas out there. But we get at them by making sure that they don't do damage to a process that's served us well over a number of years. And so the first question I always ask is, if you're suggesting a reform, what problem are you trying to solve? Otherwise, what you get are a set of reforms layered over a process that works, that simply add layers. If we're not trying to solve a problem, leave it alone. If you have a specific problem you're trying to solve, let's figure out if it's the right solution. And so there's a whole host of changes in this year's proposed National Defense Authorization Act, as there have been for years. And I enter the conversation with, I'm all for making the organization better. Let's determine what problem we're trying to solve before we start layering on new requirements.
Okay, I'm gonna, if it's all right with you, pair 2 final questions together. So we'll come here and then we'll come here. Yeah. It's coming, sorry.
My name is Matthew Friedman. I'm an innovation advisor to PAC Fleet, DIA, and several other U.S. government agencies. There have been a lot of really interesting things going on in the department, whether it's the National Security Technology Accelerator or the DIA NEDApedia. There's just a lot. Have there been any reviews any lessons learned that you can draw conclusions from even now that might impact how you think about maybe the need for special innovation authority from the Congress, or taking equity investments, or different mechanisms that will enhance the very different and disparate innovation activities that are currently occurring?
Okay, and we're going to pair that with a question over here.
Colin Clark, Breaking Defense. Morning, sir.
Good morning.
You've talked about the Terminator conundrum. You've said that Frank Kendall said he's worried our enemies will make the decision to go straight to autonomy and not worry about the man in the loop. Do we need to be pushing on a broad front quickly to come up with treaties and other agreements on this issue?
I'll take your question first. I love the idea of lessons learned. We haven't gone that far yet. What we have done is once a quarter, I will call them the group that tries to provide the leadership to the innovation engine in the department, and that is myself, Secretary Work, and Stephanie O'Sullivan from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We get together and meet and look at the progress that's been made over the course of the last quarter with the staff. So we bring in our folks from AT&L, we bring in our technology experts, we bring in the operational expertise from the joint staff as well as from the Director of National Intelligence. And we actually try to assess whether or not we're making progress along a set of initiatives, some of which are familiar, some of which are not, to make sure that we don't stall out. But to do a broad lessons learned look, we have not done that yet. It's a great idea. If you don't mind, I'm going to steal it and take it back, and we'll get to work on it. To your question about autonomy, and I have been fond of using the words the Terminator conundrum, because this is about creating entirely robotic systems that are completely autonomous and are not dependent on a human decision. So that, we're told by the technologists, by the way, we're a decade or so away from that capability. But I recall a briefing I gave about 15 years ago where I said, and it's almost a direct quote, wouldn't it be really slick if we could create a digital map of the world? And the officer I was giving the briefing to said, that's actually impossible. We don't have the data storage or the data transmission capacity to do that. I just read a book by Bill Gates that said, if you assume that bandwidth and memory are ubiquitous, how would you change your world? And so I was a bit of a smart aleck given the briefing, so I actually referred the officer I was briefing to the book. He threw me out of his office. So I suppose Google Earth is a physical impossibility. I don't think it's impossible that somebody will try to build a completely autonomous system. And I'm not talking about something like a cruise missile or a smart torpedo or a mine that requires a human to target it and release it, and it goes and finds its target. I'm talking about a wholly robotic system that decides whether or not, at the point of decision, it's going to do lethal harm. And I think we do need to examine the bodies of law and convention that might constrain anyone in the world from building that kind of a system. But I'm wholly conscious of the fact that even if we do that, there will be violators. So in spite of the fact that we don't approve of chemical or biological weapons, we know there are entities, both states and non-states, that continue to pursue that capability in our world. In spite of the fact that we say we won't kill women and children, we know there are entities in this world, state and non-state, that don't care. And so I'm cautious when I say we have to have a set of conventions and rules of the road that govern behavior in this space, because it's highly likely there will be violators. But until we understand what we want the limits to be, we don't have a baseline from which to determine if someone is moving down the path of violating a convention that could create something like a Terminator that adds incredible amounts of complexity and with no conscience to what happens on the battlefield. And so I think we have to have something. I don't know what the something is.
General Selva, I want to thank you for coming out to CSIS this morning and really creating a really rich conversation. Please join me in thanking the Vice Chairman for his time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Great to see you.